Well, Paul Volcker, the former Federal Reserve chairman, died on Sunday at 92 years old. Now, Volcker famously battled inflation, and he's best known for the Wall Street rule that bears his name. You hear a lot about the long-lasting impact of that. Brian Cheung, our Fed watcher, good person to have on the couches today to discuss Paul Volcker's legacy.
Yeah, well, I mean, his legacy was only 8 years at the Federal Reserve, but he spent his entire career in public service. He was at the U.S. Treasury for a good chunk of time, was at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York as the president there before he became the chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. And then even after he retired as Fed chair, he was still very active. He actually ended up coming back as part of the Obama administration, kind of helping in the aftermath or actually in the midst of the financial crisis. But I think he was best remembered for two things. I think one of them is definitely the role that he played in kind of helping the U.S. economy try to get back on its feet after 2008. But then in 1979, look, inflation was about 10%. He inherited a Federal Reserve that had extremely passive monetary policy, and he actually engineered what they call, his own monetary shock. He actually ended up raising interest rates to about 18%, which is something completely unfathomable today, to try to quell inflation, which he ultimately ended up doing. But at the time, very controversial. His brand of economics has become very associated with what they call the monetarist theory, which is not necessarily targeting interest rates, but doing whatever you need to do to the money supply and seeing whatever happens to interest rates after the fact to try to handle high inflation, which is why interest rates ended up going to 18%. But I think that will really be his legacy. He was only at the Fed for 8 years, but a much shorter time than Greenspan. But it seems like he's such a big name, especially because he was also physically large. He was over 6'4", I think. And, he's just a very towering figure in terms of monetary policy history.
It's so interesting because you often hear big names in finance talk about various Fed chairs, and he's the one that comes up. Ray Dalio looked to him as a mentor. He did this big, long interview with him. Just last week, I was talking to Jeffrey Gundlach, the well-known bond investor, the CEO of Double Line Capital, and we were just talking about Fed policy today. And he said you have to go back to the Volcker Fed when you had a Fed chairman that was really indifferent to the market, and actually the policy was driving the markets rather than now being driven by the market.
Right. And I think Paul Volcker would say that, that's exactly what he was trying to do. At the time, he inherited that Federal Reserve that prior to him, there was Arthur Burns, who was the head of the Federal Reserve, who was not adamant on doing much with Fed policy, wanted to let fiscal policy kind of drive the story there. But Paul Volcker was inheriting a Fed that, again, had 10% inflation. I mean, people in the United States were reeling from prices moving that fast. So he said, look, I got to do something. I got to get ahead of the curve, which is why he engineered his own monetary shock, if you will, by sending interest rates up to 18. Like, can you imagine 18% interest rates? But he did that because he needed to quell inflation. And at the time, it was controversial. It ended up helping to take inflation to a more stable level. But, definitely someone that really changed the thinking, changed the way that the Federal Reserve operated.
Really quick, because you wrote an obituary that's now on yahoofinance.com. Any sort of anecdote, little piece of color about Volcker that our viewers might find interesting?
Yeah, there's a really silly story that when he was 18 years old, he was headed off to Princeton University, and he was having an argument with his mother, and his mother was giving him a $25 allowance a month, which at the time, it sounds like not a lot, but Volcker... It probably was at the time, but Volcker was saying, I actually need more than that because inflation is happening, right?
Love
so
that.
$25 today is not the same as $25 in the second year that I'm going to be in college. And his mom said, I don't care. So that kind of started off a whole history in his entire career of fighting inflation, if you will. So kind of funny.
It all started with allowance.
Exactly.
All right, good stuff.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.